barrage of missiles and rockets stoking fears of an expanded conflict in the Middle East. Hello, everyone. I'm Sean Caleb, sitting in for Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. A lot of developments in the Middle East. The Israeli military rescued a hostage held by Hamas since last September in southern Gaza. The country is intensifying its attack on the territory. 20 people were killed on Tuesday. The United Nations, meanwhile, had to pause aid operations due to evacuation orders over the weekend. Meanwhile, Israel attacked positions of the Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Islamic group launching rockets in response to the assassination of one of its leaders. CGTN's Zahra Alderzi reports from the Lebanon-Israeli border.
The town of Khiam is directly on the Lebanese-Israeli borders, surrounded with 8 Israeli military sites. Since the beginning of the conflict, its residents have been displaced to safer areas, but they come today to check on their properties and participate in the funeral of a member of the Amal movement. Displaced residents are hoping that negotiations to end the war in Gaza will be successful, that calm will return to the front lines in southern Lebanon, and that they can return to their homes. But the failed rounds of negotiations have left the residents of the south disappointed.
I didn't lose my home, and I came to say goodbye to someone dear to me. I am sad that we can't come to our villages like the rest of the Lebanese. We had hope for the negotiations, and unfortunately, with each round of negotiations, our disappointment grows.
Some residents of this town chose to stay in neighboring villages, despite the close proximity to the front line, which sees Israeli attacks daily. We couldn't roam the Al Khiam freely due to safety concerns, as some of the surrounding villages witnessed Israeli raids while we were there. It is customary for everyone to leave the town at the end of the funeral ceremony. But from the viewpoints overlooking it, Khiam looks minimally damaged compared to other villages like Ait al-Shab and Dublida. Zahra Alderzi, CGTN, Al Khiam on Lebanon-Israeli border.
Okay, let's bring in our guest to discuss all of this. From Tehran, Ali Akbar Dareini is a researcher and writer at the Center for Strategic Studies. Meanwhile, here in Washington, D.C., Dan Arbell is a scholar in residence at the Center for Israeli Studies at American University. Khalil Jahshan is the executive director of the Arab Center, and Edmund Ghareeb is an academic and Middle East expert. I want to thank you all for taking time to chat with us. A lot to get to. Edmund, I want to begin with you. Let's back up 72 hours or so. Think about this weekend. An Israeli missile killed a Hezbollah top military leader, and the region was bracing for the worst kind of response. Airlines halted their flights. People in the region began stockpiling food and water. Anxiety clearly ratcheting up in the region. Now, we had the weekend of rockets and missiles, drone attacks, but now a somewhat uneasy calm and people wondering, is the other shoe going to drop? Kind of give us a state of where we are now and what you think is going to happen in the near future.
Clearly, what we have seen over the past weekend is the attack that took place by, first of all, what Israel described as a preemptive strike against targets in Lebanon, and the destruction, as Israel says, although there are a lot of questions about the information that the Israelis are providing, as there are some questions also about the other side. But despite the effort, despite the fact that there was 100 planes in the air, the Hezbollah used Katyushas, which are Soviet-era weapons, and launched attacks against a number of Israeli bases, and as well as intelligence centers, including Galilot and some of another very important center. This basically, so far at least, it says that it seems that after that there was a statement by Hassan Nasrallah, who's the leader of Hezbollah, who basically said that we have achieved our objectives for now. but that we reserve the right to continue to attack. And yet, it's the Israelis also said if the Hezbollah thinks that it has achieved its objectives. There was an Israeli official who spoke to Hayom newspaper, who basically said that then things seem to be getting back to normal. It appears that Hezbollah and Israel indirectly have communicated to each other that neither, at least at this point, desires further escalation, as Israel's negotiators basically were traveling to Cairo at the same time that Hamas withdrew, basically because they were raising questions about what was going on in the negotiations, and Israel attempts to change some of their demands, basically. And Hamas wants to stay committed to the report or the proposal, actually,
right,
that President Biden had offered, and yet it seems that there is a bit of a retreat. But for now, the boiling tensions seem to have returned to a simmer. Nevertheless, I think we are seeing now the danger is still there. It's real. I think the whole region is standing at the edge of an abyss.
Dan, let's pick up on that. Do you think that both sides can step back and basically say, okay, we achieved our objective. We want to step back from this chasm. If we go too far in there, this could easily escalate into the kind of fighting that really drags in the entire area. Today, the Washington Post said that the limited morning escalation allowed Hezbollah to claim vengeance and Israel to project confidence in its security apparatus. Kind of give us a feel for where you think things are, and is this going to be the kind of breath that perhaps allows people to take stock of where things are and maybe get these ceasefire discussions to really take root?
So I think that there is a chance to walk this back, and I think that to de-escalate. A lot depends on how Hezbollah will respond. Look, what happened over the weekend was Israel's preemptive strike was critical because Israel foiled a plan by Hezbollah to launch hundreds of missiles and drones towards central Israel, towards the Tel Aviv area. And that was something unacceptable. And then Israel, as it uncovered that plan, rushed to respond and effectively eliminated many of Hezbollah's missile launchers in southern Lebanon, and again, foiled that plan. Now Hezbollah responded with Katyusha rockets or other means, and as we see it now, they could each call it, they've each done their share, but it's clear, it was clear at least, that Hezbollah is still was determined to respond to a previous assassination by Israel.
Right.
Senior Commander Shuker in Beirut earlier this month. And so the question is whether Hezbollah will it suffice this latest exchange, or will they still be in a position that they feel that they need to respond? I think that no one really wants to see a war, a full-fledged war, a full-scale war. Nobody wants a further escalation of this. Neither side wants the war, but then again, miscalculations and provocations may lead in such a direction. But at this point, I believe that we can walk this back. This is a time to walk this back.
Ali Akbar, Dareini, you have a unique perspective, and we certainly appreciate you taking time to speak with us from Iran, because obviously what goes on in that country is going to be so important moving forward. Let's talk about the situation in Iran. The killing of Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh, and this is what a general with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard had to say about that killing last month.
Revenge for this criminal act, whether by the resistance axis or by the Islamic Republic of Iran, is certain.
Okay, so your reaction to that, because a few weeks ago we had an Iranian attack against Israel with very slow-moving drones, and a lot of people putting a lot of emphasis on that. They were shot down by Israel. But this Monday, once again, a general is vowing revenge. So what is the sentiment right now in Tehran? Tell us what you're hearing in that country.
Iran has made a decision to retaliate and punish Israel for its acts of terrorism, including Haniyeh's assassination in Tehran. But Iran is a rational actor. It is patient. It makes decisions on the basis of strategic calculations. Its decisions are guided by a cost and benefit analysis. But Iran's retaliation has already begun. The first phase has been psychological war. Iran has tried to keep Israel in a state of anticipation and fear. It keeps Israel waiting and guessing when it will get the hit. So this has been very devastating for Israel. The second phase will be public diplomacy and media diplomacy to show the world that Israel is the main obstacle to a ceasefire in Gaza, and that Israel is a fanatical lunatic regime that has no limits in continuing its massacre of Palestinians. And finally, it will be the security revenge and military and very likely military retaliation. But Iran, keeps everybody guessing. We don't know exactly when Iran is going to retaliate. But Iran decides itself how to retaliate, where to hit, and when to retaliate to the Israeli assassination.
Okay.
It keeps its options open.
Ali, let me follow up real quickly, because you talk about this three-pronged effort going on: the anticipation, then the media assault, if you will, and then revenge, retaliation. So do you expect that this is going to escalate and become further involve other nations within the region?
The Israeli assassination of Haniyeh sought three major goals. First, it was aimed at killing the ceasefire talks. Second, it was aimed at dragging Iran into a full-fledged war, and then hoping that it will be able to drag the US into a regional war. Netanyahu has been pushing for a US-Iran war for the past 2 decades. He has failed, and now he has the best chance to do that. But he has failed so far, and Iran doesn't want to play into Netanyahu's hands. And the third goal has been to derail President Pezeshkian's agenda and kill President Pezeshkian's foreign policy of interaction with the West. Right. Pezeshkian was elected on a platform of dialogue and interaction with the West. The Netanyahu government doesn't want tensions to be reduced between Tehran and Washington. It wants more tensions between Iran and the United States. And Netanyahu knows that if the war ends in Gaza, the next day it will be the end of his political career, and very likely he will end up in jail. So he doesn't want the war to end. Finally, Israel doesn't want a regional war on its own, but the Netanyahu government is actively trying to escalate and wants a regional war, provided that the United States is dragged into that war.
Indeed. Khalil, we can't lose sight of the fact that Gaza is the main front in this ongoing war. And you think about 40,000 civilians have already been killed. Millions of people have been uprooted time and time again. We've seen this misery kind of play out in front of cameras since last October. Talk about these latest developments. How do you think they are affecting the ongoing fighting in Gaza? Do you think at any degree it's taking attention away from all the suffering going on in that region?
I agree with the last part of your question. Essentially, these events have emboldened Israel in a way. The fact that there is a retreat, as Edmund said earlier, retreat from the abyss last minute. The fact that this regional war that was anticipated by so many in the media and analysts and what have you did not materialize. I think all of that essentially left the status quo unchanged in Gaza. Israel remains in occupation of most of Gaza. The fighting is continuing. The killing is continuing on a daily basis. The 40,000 have become 40,000 plus 500. The 90,000 have become 93,000 as of today. So the bloodletting is continuing. It hasn't stopped. Meanwhile, the danger, as several colleagues on this program have indicated, it's not over.
Right.
Misunderstanding could lead to renewed fighting. And frankly, Gaza is essentially the spark that could start that all over again. Meanwhile, in terms of strategic movements, I have a feeling, I'm not a fan of the Iranian regime per se, but I would say they seem to be gaining in this regard. Particularly when you hear our own chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who is in the region, has been there for a few days, examining, if you will, the conditions on the ground and the fighting taking place. General Brown, when he was asked today, how will the U.S. respond should escalation starts again, he said that depends on Iran. In other words, he is giving the momentum, if you will, or the choice to Iran in terms of what's going to happen in the future. He said its response, and I'm quoting him, will dictate how Israel and the U.S. will respond, whether we are going to see a broader conflict again or not. So whatever Iran is doing and its allies are doing, whether it's the Houthi in the south or Hezbollah in Lebanon, what have you, they seem to be doing the right thing in terms of at least what Ali Akbar Dareini mentioned, the first phase, if you will, of the war, which is the psychological warfare taking place right now.
Okay, I also, before I let you go, let me ask you a bit about the public perception of all of this, because the United States, Egypt, Qatar, all trying to get the parties to sit down and find a way to move forward. And at the Democratic National Convention last week, the Democrats had an Israeli family who has a hostage in the region being held, had a very primetime slot to talk. But there were no Palestinians talking. What kind of message do you think that sends the rest of the world?
Actually, the loser in this particular incident, which is the failure of the Democratic Party to take advantage, if you will, of the circumstances in there and have people from both sides address people at the audience at the convention and the national audience watching that. They failed to do that, and it shows basically it's a reflection on American democracy. It's not a reflection on the Israelis or on the Palestinians, for that matter. The Palestinians were there. There are many Palestinian American Democrats who were attending there and participating in the process. Several of them could have been a good choice to address the convention and present their perspective, particularly on the humanitarian issues that concern them. And yet the party decided to chicken out. I think the party could have gained support nationally rather than lose support from Israel's supporters or lose contributions from Israel's supporters. I think in balance, the party could have gained some momentum in the upcoming elections, but they chose not to do that. That was very disappointing for Arab American Democrats.
Dan, if I can go to you, the Israeli delegation is apparently going to be going to Doha on Wednesday. Further talks about this. We know Antony Blinken has been there a number of times. The CIA chief has been there for the United States as well. Bring us up to date on these talks. Both sides are blaming each other. Is there any reason to believe they're going to find some common ground?
You know, it's very frustrating. These negotiations have been ongoing, and basically, if we look at it, these are negotiations that are taking place with only one side present. Hamas is not at the talks and is represented by Egypt and Qatar, who are kind of intermediaries, but there's no possibility of getting Hamas to the table, and that makes it very, very difficult to advance these talks. Also, you know, Israel has been adding more demands, which is also making it difficult. Over the last weekend, as Blinken was here and talks were started in Qatar, and then they moved to Cairo, there was very, you know, high hopes that this would finally lead to a ceasefire hostage release deal. That did not happen. There was a sense that, you know, no more negotiation will take place. But then we hear in recent days that talks are continuing kind of at a low, away from the media, away from the public eye, and that some understandings have been reached. But at the end of the day, without a willingness and flexibility by Hamas mainly, and also Netanyahu to move forward, nothing will happen. And unfortunately, again, I'm talking about the tragic situation in which also the 108 Israeli hostages
Exactly.
held by Hamas are still there and are, as the days go by, their fate becomes more and more precarious.
Indeed, and we know that the people in Israel have been saying, raising their voices, urging Netanyahu to find a way forward. And I wanted to talk a bit about Ehud Olmert, the former Israeli prime minister. He wrote a pretty tough article that appeared in Haaretz newspaper, Dan, saying that that Netanyahu simply doesn't want to get the hostages back right now, that it's in his best interest to drag Iran further into this conflict, then involving the United States to give him a stronger position to move forward on this. Our guests have talked about that earlier. I'd like to get you to weigh in on that.
I'd say that politically, Netanyahu, one thing that he wants is to continue being prime minister. And with his coalition partners, he understands that it will be that if he reaches a deal according to the current conditions being discussed, his coalition partners will withdraw, and that will leave him without a government, without a coalition. So unfortunately, the way I see it, I think that Netanyahu is dragging on with the negotiations and is not bringing them to a resolution, despite the fact that many in Israel, including the defense establishment, his own defense minister, the IDF, and the Mossad, the Shin Bet, others are saying, the time has come to do this. So it's one man's will against everybody else's. Unfortunately, I think Ehud Olmert is right, and that Netanyahu is just, while I have to say, Sinwar and Hamas were the main obstacle. Then you have Israel, which is also led by Netanyahu, which is also making it very hard to get to a deal.
Edmund, an election year here in the United States, and clearly it would benefit the Democrats to a large degree if they could find a way to get everybody to sit down and find a ceasefire. But a lot of people have said that Joe Biden and his administration just does not have the clout that it has had in the past in terms of trying to get Netanyahu to lean forward to find some way to end the fighting and end the suffering in that region.
That's a very good question. I mean, it's amazing when you think of it, that a country which relies on the United States for economic, military, political, diplomatic support, the United States, this administration is unable to influence it, even when they realize that the policies pursued by Prime Minister Netanyahu are doing damage to Israel and to the United States as well. The United States is becoming somewhat isolated internationally, and Israel is in fact becoming isolated. This is what we have heard from a number of senior Israeli officials who have warned that what's happening now is doing a lot of damage to Israel, but particularly Israel is losing the support of a lot of its friends, as the head of the Shin Bet said, as well as he described also what's going on inside Israel. Right now, we're seeing new campaign, basically an escalation, a new military operation against Jenin and the West Bank. And it seems that more and more Palestinians are getting killed by settlers who are expelling them from their lands and taking over, while the government looks the other way. And it seems that there are a group of extremists such as Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, who are senior officials in the government, who are supporting these policies and almost establishing their own militias, like Ben-Gvir is trying to doing that.
Right.
So this is what I think is part of the danger. At the same time that we're seeing this in the United States, I think the administration finds itself in a very difficult position. On the one hand, they realize that they need the support of the Israel lobby, Israel's friends in the United States, who are very powerful, very influential, contribute a lot of money. At the same time, they are also concerned about the changing public opinion. There was about maybe a week or so ago, there was a new poll taken by the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations. This council basically, their poll asked a question. One of the questions they asked, would you, as basically they were asking the American public, would you support sending American troops to help Israel against Iran or against some of its other neighbors if they are attacking?
Right.
For the first time in history, 56% of the American people said no. So they would oppose that. That's quite a shift, a very significant shift in public opinion, because the last poll that was taken and asked this question showed that 53% of the American people would support sending American troops to help Israel.
That's interesting. And Ali, we're kind of tight on time, but we know the Qatari Prime Minister was in Tehran recently, and he came back saying Iran doesn't fear an escalation, but they're not necessarily opposed to it either. What are your thoughts on that statement?
The Qatari foreign minister was in Tehran for consultations. Apparently, he carried messages urging Iran to exercise restraint, and at the same time, giving some assurances that Qatar is doing its best to help a ceasefire. But the tragedy is that while Hamas is committed to the Biden proposed ceasefire, the Biden administration itself is not committed to that ceasefire. The Biden administration's influence on Netanyahu may be limited, but the United States has sufficient leverage to pressure and force the Netanyahu government to a ceasefire. Israel cannot fight for more than 5 days without U.S. military support. And the Americans keep sending weapons and supporting Israeli genocide against Palestinians. So in that sense, the Americans are an accomplice in the genocide against Palestinians. But at the same time, I see that the Israeli defense doctrine is not based on containment of an enemy attack. Right. It's based on offensive mode. It is Israel's military doctrine to take the war into the territory of its enemy. And for the first time, we see that Hezbollah is attacking military and intelligence sites close to Tel Aviv, and it has weapons that can reach the farmost tip of Israel at Eilat.
And I'm sorry, gentlemen, we're going to have to leave it there. We are out of time. But Edmund, Dan, Khalil, Ali, I want to thank you all for taking time to chat with us. And of course, you, the viewers, want to thank you for watching another edition of The Heat.